I think we can do it. I'm leaving it more free form this week, as you remember, so you guys are gonna have to jump in.
Maybe that's not a good idea.
I find it hard to believe that the cases that she chose were contemporary for when she wrote it. Seems to me they're back in the 60s, but.
Well, yeah, that was around the time of my my grad education. So the neural networks were really hitting everything big then.
For me, the discussions were very intriguing and really got my curiosity up. I'm wondering what the modern resolution ideas would be.
I am too. It's not actually my field, like the archaeological stuff and the super cognitive stuff. I mean, I've seen building on. I think everyone kind of is more inclined to go with the neural network model. I think the neural network took over.
But it really is true, though, that you automatically, when you read about evolution, the evolution of the human species, you're led to automatically think about tools as being things used by men, created by men and used by men, and that's just without even thinking about it, But it's very interesting.
Well.
So the way she no, I'm serious. So it's very interesting the way she covers that. So of course, then the question, well, why would this particular species need tools because it was a vegetarian? Well, yeah, actually, there are good reasons for it using tools and needing tools, especially if it's a vegetarian, So.
Well, I would challenge that everybody is led to just automatically assume that tools are a male, a male thing.
Yeah.
I think cross-culturally, there's a lot of difference in tool use, and perspective-wise, male versus female. I mean, I'm a female. I use lots of tools, and so I don't think of tools as a male thing. But I think you're right that there's like a like all those jokes that hinge on he opened his eyes and the doctor realized the patient was the son of the doctor. How could this be? And it's hinges on the doctor is actually female. So it's what it's doing is it's playing with our cultural assumptions that doctors are males. Probably is these jokes are going to be less and less of a riddle as more and more kids grow up with female doctors.
No, but I'm just thinking, the way the narrative is told, like in the popular, accounts and so on, the way the narrative is told, that's, or at least the way it was told. But.
Well, I think that's great to point out, because I think man the hunter was the predominant archaeological explanation, and then since that time it has been challenged with this, woman, the tool user, hunter-gatherer, farmer, women as the origin of our agriculture. That was another thing that I think that's another parallel example, that there was an assumption that the agricultural revolution was an invention of men. But Paul just kind of, eventually pointed out, well, if women are usually the hunter-gatherers, they would be much more likely to be the developers of agriculture, because they're the ones working with the plants and retrieving fruits and vegetables. So they'd be more likely to cultivate these.
Okay, folks, we should get started. Andres has to leave at 6. There's feast tonight.
Yeah, sorry about that, everybody. Just putting it out there, though.
I I think this possibly could be one of the most fun things we do. However, at 6, we were going to kind of start to talk a little bit about other plans, other ideas. It's going to be terrible to miss you, Andres. Anyway, could somebody
I'll catch up
volunteer?
with everybody soon. And if this video will be posted, I'll catch up that way as well. Thank you very much, everyone.
So who wants to offer a prayer?
I will. Is my microphone on?
Yes.
Yes.
For thou kind Lord, thou hast created all humanity from the same stock. Thou hast decreed that all shall belong to the same household. In thy holy presence they are all thy servants, and all mankind are sheltered beneath thy tabernacle. All have gathered together at thy table of bounty. All are illumined through the light of thy providence. God, thou art kind to all. Thou hast provided for all, dost shelter all, conferrest life upon all. Thou hast endowed each and all with talents and faculties, and all are submerged in the ocean of thy mercy. For thou kind Lord, unite all. Let the religions agree and make the nations one, so that they may see each other as one family, and the whole earth as one home. May they all live together in perfect harmony. O God, raise aloft the banner of the oneness of mankind. O God, establish the most great peace. Cement thou, O God, the hearts together. O thou kind Father God, gladden our hearts through the fragrance of thy love. Brighten our eyes through the light of thy guidance. Delight our ears with the melody of thy word, and shelter us all in the stronghold of thy providence. Thou art the mighty and powerful. Thou art the forgiving, and thou art the one who overlooketh the shortcomings of all mankind.
Okay, Whitney, it's in your good hands.
Okay, so we had decided that last week that we would spend the first hour discussing the next 2 chapters, let's see, 6 and 7 as a whole, and allow us to bring up what we think is interesting out of it. And then the last half hour, we thought we'd follow up on the discussion that we started last week of, would we want to write a paper together? What are we going to do to translate this this history of discussion into discourse, contribution to discourse, maybe that's how to generally call it. So are we still okay with that schedule? I mean, one possibility is we could reverse it if we wanted to include Andres in the discussion about discourse. Any thoughts? Anyone want to try to reverse the order? Half an hour of discussion on discourse, and then following that an hour on the chapters, or just stick with our?
I think that may not be a bad idea. We can limit ourselves to a half hour. We can start the ball rolling, plant the seeds, and then come back to it. And I do want to hear from Andres. So.
Yeah, this is a great opportunity to make sure that we have good input from Andres.
Okay, then maybe, is everyone else give a thumbs up if you're agreed with that? Sounds good. Okay. Peer pressure. How could you not at this point? Okay, so we'll have half an hour. I'm going to set a timer unless Roger wants to monitor it. half an hour of discussion on what do we do with this learning and these interactions to impact discourse. The discussion last week was, hey, do we have something here? Do we have something interesting to say and we could write together? So anyone chime in with your thoughts. Stephen.
Can I share my enthusiasms? I think this particular book is very well written, and as the last chapter shows, very entertaining as well. And it does bring up some important and interesting issues. One of the issues is the one that Todd has brought up, which is that when you study the how social phenomena enter into how science is done, both in the assumptions that are made, the way that evidence is defined, and so on and so forth, it crucially affects science, but not necessarily eliminates progress towards objectivity. On the other hand, those social phenomena that affect science are part of a worldview, or can be parts of worldviews. Worldviews are, in a certain sense, like big ships. They move steadily. They don't change direction very easily. Given that a worldview can influence science, how do you escape the gravitational pull of such worldviews? And I think this particular book balances aspects of those two things in a really marvelous way. I think for Baha'is, the impact is, how do we fully understand what it means to say that the revelation of Baha'u'llah is scientific in its method? I don't think that means that it's physics or biology or chemistry or even anthropology. What it does suggest is there's something to the way that science is done or reasoning is carried through, working with evidence that creates very real truths that have aspects of objectivity. And very crucial to it are things like diversity, and that we see that from this chapter that we're talking about. So my feeling is that we have a manuscript in front of us, a book in front of us, that outlines a very important problem and kind of animates a way to increasingly understand what the Baha'i faith teaches about the unity of science and religion. So I think I am delighted by this book and the possibility that we can go together, work together to see it to a level of discourse that's interesting and helpful.
Thank you, Stephen. Robert. Oh, you're on mute still.
Okay. One thing I was going to say is that one thing Longino establishes a very good case for background assumptions being necessary to science, or part and parcel of science. This is something you can't escape, which makes a lot of sense. And in the Baha'i context, what is valuable or what is necessary for advancement is diversity within a unified vision. And so that is something which I think, but what does unified vision mean? What do we mean by unified vision? I mean, that's something that can be discussed and explored. But you need diversity within unified vision. Without the unified vision, you can't make progress. Without the diversity, you can't make progress. So Longino's book really brings that to the fore. the idea of the necessity for a unified vision, and then this, or at least the role of it, and the necessity for diversity within that.
Thank you, Robert. Farhad.
Yeah, during the week, I had the chance to see the documentary Coded Bias on Netflix, which we talked about a few weeks ago or months. And I highly recommend that if people haven't seen it. And that sort of deals with a lot of these similar issues of gender and especially race discrimination in our automated systems and so on. And I guess it's a more contemporary kind of discussion than the Longino one, although similar background. But what I was going to say was, I think that the House of Justice emphasis on participating in the discourses of society is to participate in the external discourses and not necessarily focus on, just another all Baha'i, discussion or paper or whatever, even though, that could also be an outcome. But I think, if we're doing something for the Journal of Baha'i Studies or for the Baha'i Studies Conference or something like that, the audience is pretty much a Baha'i audience. So I would say, what would be more interesting to me would be, what are the opportunities to participate in this discourse in the external community? And I know the difficulty there is, how do you find where that discourse is happening? But it is happening, as that Coded Bias documentary shows, that these things are being talked about at conferences, in workplaces, all over the place. So we just have to find a way to to see where it's happening and join in.
I'm still here, guys, but my internet was unstable, so I added an extra network. Speaking of networks. Okay, let's see if that helps. Thank you, Farhad. Robert.
Well, I was going to say, if we're thinking about discourse, if we're thinking about a paper or so some kind of publication, and if we're thinking about something and along the lines of discourses in society, as Farhad pointed out, then we might want to think about something that would be published in Zygon, which is which is which is an academic journal. But that's a possibility.
Thank you, Robert. Again, I'm still here fiddling with my internet. Stephen.
No, Andres first.
Oh, sorry, Andres. I'm sorry. Andres, I think, let's do Andres. Thank you.
I was just going to say, one of the most important things that we can get out of this book, and perhaps I'm thinking in a conventional, adversarial model, because we are told that the Baha'i faith will come under attack at some point. And I think one of the strongest things that we can derive from what we've learned from this book is, a very systematic and possibly standardized defense of the concept of diversity. In the same way that we have to defend in the modern vernacular, we have to defend unity from the charge of promoting hegemony or the loss of diversity. We also have to promote the concept of diversity as something other than a complete free-for-all, and to make it absolutely clear that with both of them together, that does not mean that anything goes. As in this country, you have to give equal say to all perspectives, including some that are extremely outmoded. Whereas we can actually be able to say that some things don't get to have their say in a society that's just. If you believe that people who have a different skin color than you do who are born on different soil than you are, or who worship a different God than you do, or do not warrant moral consideration, then your perspective does not warrant a voice, and it does not warrant representation, and it does not have, and in fact, it might be daring enough to say, you do not have the right to hold that opinion. And we will be able to defend that stance by defending both the concept of unity and the concept of diversity. In the philosophy class, I actually tried to model the two concepts of unity, the difference between unity in a hegemonic model and unity, for example, in a harmonic model. And the Baha'i concept of unity is harmonic, whereas all the charges of communism and the like would be a hegemonic model of unity. And that experiment has been tried and it has failed. So I think more than anything, we can start by having the standardized defense of diversity, so that we get to say that we don't have to honor, that we honor cultural diversity. That doesn't mean you have to honor every part of every culture, because you could dispense with things. You could still have Spanish culture and Spanish derived culture without the bullfight. And you can still have Islam, and you can have the traditional religions without involuntary mutilation of young women, for example. And so I think being able to have that defense, it becomes a tool, because you can use it to teach, you can use it to pioneer, and you can use it as a support of executing the faith in a scientific way. Scientific in the sense that you keep what works and you dispense with what doesn't. That's my input. Having a defense of unity as its own tool, and if more people have that, then they can use it in different ways, rather than just assuming that they're going to be in front of some kind of tribunal at some point. Even though we're told that the faith will face that in the Western world, at least.
That's fascinating input. I'm gonna let Roger go. Oh, wait, no, Stephen and then Roger.
Briefly, I just want to point out that things like Zygon, where is Zygon? Maybe it's there. Or some of these other kinds of magazines are academic level, professional level, and they're not necessarily easy to get published in. It may be worthwhile to think of how we develop capacity among ourselves to reach the level to publish in Zygon. And from that point of view, perhaps targeting the Journal of Baha'i Studies might be a step-by-step way to go ahead. That's all I wanted to say.
I think my internet is unstable. Was everyone else able to hear Stephen fine?
Yes.
We can hear you too. We just can't see you.
Yeah,
You're
you're
frozen,
frozen, but
sorry.
we can hear you. We can hear you clearly, though.
Okay. So
No, now we can't hear you. You have to turn on your
it's
microphone.
muted.
Okay, I had to rejoin. Sorry about that. Hopefully,
Okay, so my biggest thought now is I'm trying to decide what topics we like to explore, and therefore where we think we have a contribution, and let all the rest of the details follow. That's just my way of going about these things. Picking an appropriate venue or format, or deciding how mature we are in our thinking, or how much more preparation we need. I think all that comes out of trying to say something that's useful, insightful. And I think one of the things that we talked about doing was studying consultation and its impact. And I think that a comparative study of transformative interrogation and consultation, and side by side with that, or in parallel with that, or maybe as an adjunct study, a comparison of the processes of science and the process of learning in the Baha'i faith, putting those things side by side and sort of analyzing their components, I think that we will definitely reveal something of great interest if we do that systematically. So that's, I don't know if that's a paper, a book, or just an activity, but I think it's something I'd like to do going forward. And I think that the chance of something coming out of it is pretty high. The other thing is that we are faced with the question of what's it for? And I think we all believe that this is important material and that there are real problems to address. So it may be that I would like to see some relevant discussion at some point about what we're learning has to say about how society might address these problems. In other words, because we're Baha'is, we know that the unity of humankind is a pressing need, and that it's the disunity is actually spilling over and contaminating science. That's one of the ways to look at this. So I'll just shut up at that point. I think on that topic, I think that there is probably 2 or 3 things more that interest me a great deal about asking questions about just what it means to have diversity in the scientific enterprise. It's somewhat parallel to the question of where does variation come from for evolution? What is diversity accomplishing inside the scientific process? And where does it come from? Baha'is are much better able to talk about such things in a context of understanding unity and diversity in a spiritual, for what it says about the nature of mankind. But Longino just kind of has to take it for granted because she doesn't have a unifying concept. So I think pointing that out about Longino's thinking is a way to help lead it to the next level. And we can say from a Baha'i perspective, it's obvious that it ought to go like this, but it's also possible to say that in more objective terms. So that's that falls in the category of a Baha'i critique of Longino, praise and trying to stretch it to the next level. So that's the 3 things that I think, 3 topic areas that I think we have something to offer.
I'll take a turn now. I've been thinking this week that we might have multiple topics and multiple styles of approaching the topic that maybe we don't want to wash out in just a common paper. So I was thinking that maybe we could pick up some of these ideas and suggest an edited issue of a journal. I'm kind of inclined, as I think I was picking up from Stephen. He was in and out because of my unstable internet, but my prediction is that we would have an easier time pulling off such a thing at Journal of Baha'i Studies, and that might be okay, because I think we need it. I mean, I was very inspired by Andres's description of, defending this concept, these central concepts, to prepare us and to have it there to think with and to refer to. I don't think it's, I have found in my own experience talking with people outside of the faith that I use concepts all the time that I have read in Journal of Baha'i Studies. Todd, I refer to your paper all the time. And it might not be, I don't think that if we went for something like that, that we would be limiting our exposure. If we could have an edited issue or a common paper in Zygon, I think that would be excellent. It would be, it'd be really interesting because the scholars who read that journal may become aware of the faith through a paper. But anyway, I wanted to float the idea that maybe we have 4 different or 5 different topics, and we don't want to necessarily limit ourselves to a single paper that we try to work on collectively. Todd.
Yeah, I was going to suggest something along those same lines. The next journal that's coming out is going to be a special journal insofar as it's the first time that I know of, I think that we, or at least for many, many years, where a group of people have been coming together like this and focus on a particular topic, and then they've each written their own essays on that particular theme. And then they went through a process of reviewing each other's essays and providing feedback. And so in that sense, it was collective, but at the same time, it was also individual. Because each of the essays are primarily written by an individual, but the process was collective also insofar as they were sharing these with each other. Same thing happened with the book that Jeff Cameron and Ben Schul wrote or edited. And, there was a whole process of these individuals who wrote the different chapters, writing their chapters, sharing the chapters with each other, providing feedback to each other, and then trying to ensure that there was some sort of continuity between the chapters, but not being overly restrictive in terms of what each person was writing about. So that for me would be a model that might be something for us to look at. And then a second model that's also, I think, potentially viable, which I'm participating in now for another endeavor, is that the group identifies, say, 5 questions, and then each person in the group takes an opportunity to write as much as they would like on each one of those 5 questions. And then you can organize the journal by the question, and you just sort of, you see how different people have addressed each of those particular questions. So that's a second option. But in both cases, the individual has a greater freedom or latitude to write what he or she would like to write. But then it's also shared and there's discussed and that sort of thing. So I'm not attached to either one of those, but I don't like to use the word attached, but another word is not coming to my mind.
Attracted.
Attracted, there you go, very good. I'm attracted to the idea of each of us, to the extent that we would like to, writing something that is meaningful to us based on this book, and then sharing it with each other, providing feedback and that sort of thing, so that if it comes out in the Journal for Baha'i Studies, it can be sort of framed as this is both a unity and diversity of effort, I guess is a good way of putting it.
That's really exciting to hear that this is being independently generated by other groups.
What topics interest you the most here, Todd?
What interests me the most?
Yeah, what questions or research areas or topics or whatever?
Well, I mean, I don't know exactly how I'd frame it, but definitely one thing that is of great interest to me is what you talked about, Roger, which is the relationship between her approach to transformative criticism and consultation. I think there's a lot that can be said there. I think that there's a lot that can be said about what Robert was referring to in terms of the relationship between unity and diversity, where actually many of you have been referring to this, and what that actually looks like. I think there's a lot that can be looked at in terms of the role of religion as providing the essential assumptions to help frame the scientific process. For me, there's a whole bunch that can be said there. So that would be an area that I would want, a direction that I would want to go in, for sure. So those are three things that come to mind. Oh, the relationship between this approach that she's advocating and just the whole concept of a conceptual framework, I think is another really important, exciting area to explore as well. And sorry, another fifth one is this has to do with what you wrote about, Roger, in your email, referring to Mr. Razavi's paragraph about the whole notion of participation. So she talks about diversity, but then what are the implications of that for universal participation, and what does that look like in terms of the generation of knowledge? And do we really just need to rely, for example, in order to achieve objectivity, do we really just need to rely on the review process that is currently in place, which she's a strong advocate for, or are there other mechanisms that we can explore that can help us to move towards objectivity, but also create more spaces for participation? So that for me would be another area.
I sent Todd a snapshot of the posting I put in the discussion forum about the scaffolding for science, ping-ponging off Shahriar's Razavi's comments.
Shahriar Razavi.
Shahriar Razavi. Thank you. So it's in the discussion forum, and he's not a member, so I sent it to him as well.
So I guess my suggestion is that we could decide that there are certain questions that we would all want to look at and maybe write around, or we can just sort of decide on questions that are personally meaningful to us based on this. But in any case, we could then, spend, once we finish the book, spend a couple weeks or so writing and sharing and see where that takes us.
Yeah, start with a set of good questions. Good questions are very valuable. We haven't heard from Charlotte.
Oh, good timing. Sorry, I have to eat because I have a meeting right after this. So I put myself so I could eat, and I'm all done now. I'm just really excited about the topics. Andre, this unity and diversity is such an important topic, and I loved what you said about that and the importance of it. One of the things that I was thinking about is this apathy, that I think what is happening is there's this elite scientific voice that comes out. As soon as it comes out, there's criticism, and then there's people that choose to believe it or not. And it's almost as if there is no venue, there's no voice for them before that happens. So once it's out in the media, we're taking that diversity of view right out of the field because it's been proclaimed almost. And I think, I'm not quite sure if there is a willingness for the voices, that diversity of voices, to come to the table even before that happens. So back to whole part of that consultation is looking at the apathy of people. And I'm saying that because often when people are understanding the importance of consultation, they ask for voices and it's not coming. You know, like it's almost as if I understand when I hear that as a Baha'i, I'm thinking, yes, of course, we all need a voice. We all need to have opportunities to express ourselves. The rest of the community, I feel, are almost don't see themselves as a part. And then when it's proclaimed, okay, we've heard from everyone, that's when they start becoming very, very active. That's what I'm sensing is what can we do before, you know, like it's almost as if it needs this revolutionary way of thinking in the public. So anyway, I'm really quite excited about this. I think this is going to be very helpful in that way to bring, you know, to what can we do to encourage voices, you know, that diversity of voices. So anyway, I'm quite excited no matter where we go. And I do like the idea of not focusing on one paper and maybe 2 or 3 would be wonderful. Yeah, great.
Well, my timer just went off. So we've spent a half an hour talking about this. It feels to me like we have generated kind of a momentum to our consultation. And shall we wrap that up and pick it up again next week?
I'd like to see a next step sort of plan. Is it just next week we start accumulating topics or different approaches? Like there's 2 different things that have been discussed, topical and procedural, right? So we just start listing them? Like on a whiteboard?
maybe we could put you know, questions or suggested topics or whatever in the discussion board. And
that's
we might
already been done. I agree. That's already in process, but Todd's not a member of the discussion center.
I would rather, I'm not a big proponent of turning all of our discussions into discussion center items, just because I like the fluidity of the conversation here.
Yep.
And I'm not willing to put my thoughts in writing till I'm ready to put them in writing. So I don't want them. I'm not going to put them in the discussion center.
So why don't we just come back together in a week and start to take notes?
Yeah, I think we can cogitate and chew on what we've discussed today. I do, like I said, I think I feel that we've started from a place and we've moved somewhere together.
Yep.
And I think we can pick it up again next week and move a little farther. Stephen?
If I pretend to be a secretary, it seems to me that we have a fair amount of agreement that we could start gathering questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. And I think that we've talked about, you know, either collectively coming up with questions and then dividing them up, or coming in with what we're each interested in. And maybe we could do some combination of the 2. So maybe that's where we start next week, is discussing that and maybe everyone bring questions in.
I have one other practical concern. There are a couple of people who come to the Sunday group, and they could be included as well.
How are they going to be included, Roger?
Well, they could be asked to contribute questions or to respond to them and things like that.
Can you do that?
I can.
And if we have this process of co-editing, we can circulate among everybody, maybe.
Okay.
All right. So we move on to chapters 6 and 7, the collective chapters 6 and 7. So I'll just launch it with just an overview, if that's okay. Not an overview, but my my perspective on these two chapters. What she's doing is she has taken us through a philosophical exploration of the various ways in which background assumptions shape science, scientific endeavor. And she's now bringing out these examples to show us what power this, I don't know, framework for analyzing science, what power it has. So she's in chapter 6 for each of the two main examples. She's going through data, hypotheses, and reasoning and assumptions. And then she has she has kind of a parallel set of critiques in chapter 7 and some overlap in the research. So as we discussed last week, we were just going to allow people to bring up what they found interesting in these overlapping research topics that she brought out and analyzed and critiqued. So I'm going to open the floor to everyone. Stephen.
What struck me, of course, in addition to how funny the chapter was and fun, what struck me is the kind of, in nascent form, the kind of understanding that there are hidden assumptions throughout these kind of hilarious sounding theories, so on and so forth. And that these days, as we start to examine the roles of racism and artificial intelligence throughout science, throughout the various kind of ways that society does things, it's increasingly apparent to us. And we now start to know the mechanisms by which these assumptions penetrate at many different levels into all aspects of things that come to play in doing science. In other words, at the end of the pandemic, at the end of Black Lives Matter, we have a much more sophisticated understanding of the mechanisms by which these influences start to play a role.
Yeah, I agree that the pandemic and Black Lives Matter are a collective education in mechanisms. Robert.
Well, one thing that really struck me is these, with regard to gender issues. The Baha'i faith gives a unified vision, which is, or gives a background assumption, which is simply unequivocal in the statement that women will work their way into all professions equally with men. Of course, you could say it the other way around. Men will also work their way into all professions equally with women, like men will, and so on. That's ground level. That's a ground level assumption. So that, and it seems to me that something like that is probably absolutely necessary if we're going to make progress. So, for instance, she points out with the issue of, well, what drove human evolution? Is it man the hunter? Is it woman the gatherer? Well, as she points out, the data is really not going to change. We have essentially all the data that we're going to ever get. The data being bones, teeth, and tools. And so for the rest of next 1,000 years, we're going to be working with the same data. What do we do with that data? And something like the Baha'i assumption of the fundamental equality of men and women is going to be necessary if we want to get patterns of evolution. There's this, I'd like to just relate a very brief anecdote. In Gabon, this is true about 20, 30 years ago. I don't know if it's still true, but there are a number of different tribal people come into the city, and they've all been categorized. So this tribe, they drive the taxis. They have tremendous qualities for driving taxis. This tribe, you know, they dig the ditches. If you want to dig, if you want a ditch to be dug, you get somebody from this tribe because that's what they're really good at. And it goes on. Every single tribe has particular, you know, this is obviously in the great scheme of things, it's all fake. It's all false. However, in the capital city of Gabon, people think that way, you know, that, oh yeah, these people are really good at that. These people are good at that. These people are good at that, you know. So you want to be a taxi driver? Oh, sorry, you're from the wrong tribe, because the only people really good at driving taxis are such and such. So this just shows anyway. And so you look at the fundamental equality of races, or the fundamental equality, human equality, you know, that just washes all that stuff away.
So just for me going, I'm getting an echo happening.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's Farhad or Roger or who.
It's not me. I'm using earbuds, so there's no speaker playing.
It might be me. I had a glitch there, so I'll actually just drop out and reconnect.
Oh, we'll just, okay. We can just try muting you for a sec and see if it goes. Oh, well,
I think he's going to reconnect.
okay.
Okay, should we wait for him to reconnect and then Roger and Todd?
Yeah, let's wait. I'd like to.
There was, you know, that when the Chinese came over, often they would start laundromats or laundry service. And can you just imagine in the 1800s how terribly hot it was? And probably the most desirable of all occupations was laundry. And yet many people said that the Chinese people like doing laundry. That was just something everybody thought, that they just liked doing laundry. And anyway, so when you were talking, Robert, I was just thinking about those poor Chinese people. They were always pegged it, and they didn't like it. Who would like it? But anyway, they were just pegged at that.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. Let's go to, we're glad you're back, Farhad. We'll go to Roger and then Todd.
Well, I was thinking through here about why my takeaway from chapter 6 is that when it comes to these questions about human nature and development and evolution, gender differences and things, the situation's so complicated that forming theories about them is excessively complicated, extremely difficult, because we don't have a sense of sure footing. So I recall the situation that evolutionary theory was in back in the day when form was assumed to reflect descent. And with the advent of biochemical tracing of descent, there were many cases that emerged that turned out to be convergent evolution of different lineages into the same form. So a deeper understanding of the subject matter let theoreticians sort out what's what and invited a review of all the evidence that had been considered before. And I wonder if the same thing's not going on with some of these topics that she's addressing on purpose. She's picking the tough nuts. So I'm looking now at page, I have just 2 comments. I'll make them as brief as I can. On page 108, I believe, there's a long paragraph that starts under the heading reasoning and assumptions. And I was really struck by one particular sentence that's buried in there. That the background assumption here seems to be that in the absence of countervailing factors, what seems to be is a good indication of what is. What seems to be is a good indication of what is. And I suddenly thought, what we're faced here is with people who were people in that situation saying, look, all we got to do is accept appearances because that we don't have any theoretical way to sort of untangle this yet. And I'm saying that is right territory for bias to come in. That when we're motivated as humans to try to find and sort things out, that's the state where we're going to be most subject to our biases. And that occurs a general rule to me. That suggests that there's a general rule. The other thing is a little bit later on, and it's probably on page 111. The paragraph begins assessing the evidential.
Starts at the bottom of page 110.
Yep, assessing the evidential relevance of stone tools. In which there are no theory-embedded generalizations of which we can use to sort out one interpretation from the other.
Mhm.
And the central paragraph for me is, it is rather a matter of choosing or using a framework of interpretation, male or female centered, and assigning evidential relevance to the data on the basis of the assumptions of the framework. Now, imagine, in this case, imagine science is looking through a gemstone that's faceted and cut. And basically we're trying to understand what we're looking at, and all we can do is look through one set of facets or another set and get a shifting image. And it takes a great deal of study and inference to sort of sort out what's actually behind the stone. Is that metaphor a bit too strained? This idea of shifting frameworks of interpretation is exactly the problem that she addressed earlier when she talked about how did she put it? Finding or discovering a process of uncovering and discovering shared assumptions, or broadening shared, you have a diversity of views, then you can talk about, well, wait a minute, you're assuming this or you're assuming that. We can see the assumptions better with a diversity of views, right? Here, she's stuck because there's like this, she's saying we can find no grounds to get past that. The diversity, we're stuck with the diversity or something. In other words, she seems a bit flustered. My take is that here, where you have a unified vision of what is humanity, the fact that there's something tricky between the prescriptive role of saying, well, this ought to be the kind of view we prefer, the normative choice, having a normative choice for dictating standards of views, or the possibility that the very fact that science is a human activity implies that we can make a generalization about how to choose among worldviews. So to say, okay, this is a process of us as reasoning creatures making a choice about how this phenomenon is actually looked at. I think that's a little bit too complicated and snake swallowing its tail sort of logic. But I think she's wrestling with the same issue, and I think that what we bring to bear on it that's new is, and I think this was mentioned in our catalog of topics and suggestions, that we have the possibility of bringing new values to science that through the process of comparative religion or progressive revelation, we can say, look, this is a universal trait, a universal human value. And in a choice situation, we have to recognize that may be a contribution to something true about the thinking of science. And so therefore true about something about the world, the ontology, not just epistemology, but the ontology of the world. So the framework of interpretation is in part a choice. And I don't think Longino wants to make it totally relative, and I don't think I do either, but I'm saying it is also a creative act. I better stop because I don't know where I'm going to end up.
Thank you so much, Roger. Todd, Robert, and then Stephen, I believe.
Actually, Stephen.
Okay, Robert, Todd, Stephen, Robert.
So I actually, I think I'm sort of going in the same direction that Roger is going in. So if we can go back to page 111, exactly the same spot. The next sentence says, on their own, the data are dumb, requiring such assumptions in order to function as evidence. The frameworks belong to ways of seeing and being in the world that assign different degrees of reality and value to male and female activities. And then if you flip all the way over to page 130, towards the bottom, the second last paragraph from the bottom says, while this framework is where is it? No, just the last sentence. As long as both frameworks offer coherent and comprehensive accounts of the relevant data, neither can displace the other. So, again, I really want to preface my comments by saying that I love this book. So I'm playing devil's advocate because I've had many opportunities to grapple with this and others as well. And in my dissertation, I grappled with this as well. So one fundamental problem for me with what is being said here is essentially what's coming across is that the frameworks are almost omnipotent. Mm-hmm. And that the data, as she says here, is dumb on its own. The data doesn't have any role to play on its own. It only has a role to play if it is picked up by a particular framework and shaped in a certain way by that particular framework. So what I find needs to be introduced into this, because I think her analysis is very powerful, but it doesn't go all the way. And in taking it to the next step is actually figuring out under what circumstances does the data, does the evidence itself impinge upon a framework, such that the framework is not omnipotent, but actually the framework has to respond to the data in a certain respect and actually might shift as a consequence of the data. So that's a whole topic, and one of the papers that Michael and I wrote a while back is that some basically there's some elements of reality that are more impinging than other elements of reality. And there's the relationship between the framework and reality that can vary depending on what reality you're actually looking at. You know, I mean, one concrete example right now is the virus. You know, you can twist the virus around in many different ways, and many people are with their conspiracy theories. But the fact of the matter is it does impinge upon our consciousness. It does compel us to think in a certain way about it. And there's always going to be variation there. But it does have weight to it that makes us think in a certain way. So I don't want to go to the other extreme and say, of course, it's definitely not the case that that reality impinges such that we all have a unified understanding of something. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, though, that there is some weight to reality that has an impact on the way we think, and vice versa as well. And that doesn't come across to me in this particular chapter to the extent that it can. A second thing that I would, and this is sort of a macro issue, is Longino herself is looking at the data that she's analyzing in a certain way through a certain framework. She has her own assumptions that she's bringing to this analysis herself. And so that's just something to keep in mind, because you will always, part of being scientific is being able to be reflexive as well, and to see how one can sort of analyze one's own approach to it. Anyway, my main concern is the first one, in that, you know, somehow reality has to have a role in how it's interpreted. And that role can vary depending on the reality that we're actually looking at. But I'd be very interested to hear from the physicist, because her examples are biological primarily, or evolutionary. You know, when it comes to physical reality and the study of physics, the same thing can be applied. Yes, you can have different frameworks, but are those frameworks not in some sense responsive as well as influencing the way reality is read as well?
Such as with this news of the muon's strange behavior that just hit the news.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question before we go on, Todd? Would you clarify, would you say that her assumptions are meta-scientific?
Well, I would say they're primarily sociological, honestly.
Okay.
Okay, so we have Stephen and Robert.
Let me try to frame my answer partly in response to what Todd just said. What I'm seeing as a powerful component, although not overemphasized component in this chapter, is the role of feminism in offering an alternative to the kind of masculine dominated interpretation. And what she seems to be doing is illustrating the importance of diversity in developing a discourse and a dialogue. And she's specifically saying that the feminism is feeding off of the excessive masculinity or whatever, and then that the masculine approach is feeding off the feminism. So she's actually talking, if not about a Hegelian discourse, an important discourse that's illustrating the role of diversity. So what that seems to suggest is that there's a dynamic process inherent in the very processes that lead to diversity in our world. But then there's another way to look at it, which is in the terms of developing or immature and then maturing worldviews. And among those worldviews, I think we have to think about a worldview that holds that revelation is is a revealing of truth that animates even the sciences. If we look at the discourse taking place in the fields of science and religion, what we see is these kind of very dogmatic scientists like Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett, or so on and so forth, developing a rather one-sided discourse. But on the other hand, animating a investigation of the means by which religion affects humanity that's really pulling us into the modern age of understanding science. And then we have an additional worldview, how should I say, enunciated by the Baha'i teachings that kind of bring or refresh our understanding of the power of religion. So the worldviews that affect the science, I would claim, are not static. They are in the constant process of a kind of dialectic and changing and back and forth. And to a certain extent, which worldviews tend to thrive in, I guess, an evolutionary sense, depend upon the success they have in finding problems where they bring insight into it and help resolve things. So I would say that, I mean, I think I'm agreeing with Todd here, but I'm saying that the evidence seems to be that these worldviews are changing, evolving, and that the worldview of religion has a possibility of playing a powerful role in illuminating some of the things that are happening.
Thank you, Stephen. Robert, and then me.
I really like what Stephen was saying. I just wanted to go back to Todd, what Todd was asking about is there anything comparable in physics? And there is. And then there's something else I wanted to mention after that. But for instance, David Bohm developed a different view of quantum mechanics, and in which quantum mechanics is fully deterministic. And there are these pilot waves, and then things move by the pilot waves. But it turns out that his predictions, the actual equations, the predictions are exactly the same. So you have two very, very different views of quantum mechanics, what it is, what it means. And they both reduce to exactly the same equations when it comes to predicting what's going to happen if you do an experiment. And another example is let's say Lorentz's view, like after the idea that physicists had in the late 19th century was that there exists an ether, and this ether, a luminiferous ether, this ether carries electromagnetic waves. And it was discovered that the Earth's motion could not be detected relative to the ether. Well, that's a real puzzle, because the Earth, moves around the sun. It's really stretches the imagination to think the ether moves along with the Earth in all cases. So Lorentz came up with the idea that, well, if you move relative to the ether, then time slows down and lengths contract, And then Einstein had Einstein's view was very different, but ultimately much more satisfying. Now, what do we mean by satisfying? And so the physics community, after Einstein's publication of his theory of his special theory of relativity, the scientific community abandoned Lorentz's idea. Einstein used the same equations and had a different view. And out of it came the idea of space-time, space-time being the dynamic structure that it is, and then it goes on. Now, if we were to cling to Newtonian mechanics and Lorentz's view of an ether, we could probably, and then add the idea, well, the gravitational field, attracts the ether in a certain way, so that things that are deep in a gravitational field, time slows down and lengths contract. We could probably end up with a Newtonian theory which gives the same predictions as general relativity. I wouldn't want it, but it would be incredibly ugly, incredibly non-intuitive. I mean, compared to the beauty of relativity. And so I think the physics community would say this is so ad hoc, this is so ugly, this is so ridiculous that you can't accept it, you know, and so it would be thrown out. So in physics also, you can have different theories which explain the same phenomenon. So one thing though that I wanted, something else I'd like to mention, the Universal House of Justice points out that one of the features of the scientific attitude, scientific thinking, is the ability to live with contradictions. Or I'm sorry, the ability to live with ambiguity. And some of when it comes to behavioral issues, as Longino sort of hints on page 123, you know, the question comes up, well, how do hormones affect brain structure? How do hormones affect brain activity? And it seems to me she's kind of hinting that the hypotheses that were formulated are all premature. And she says that the bivalent classification system generated by purported effects was generated by purported effects of hormones rather than by chemical structure or mode of action. So it's the sort of thing that, well, you should hold off making a theory until you've made deeper investigations. So, you know, we have, you know, let's say, you know, testosterone. How does that actually affect the brain biochemically? No idea. Just they look at these correlative experiments, and without even bothering to go to think about the biochemistry of it, which would take longer, they make hypotheses. And so one aspect of hypothesis formation is the ability to hold off making hypotheses until you've gone deeper into investigation, which you could go into, or which the next generation could go into.
Thank you. Okay, I'll go next. I'm really digging this conversation that we've started to raise last week, which was the sort of the Kuhnian nature versus the what it would be that, you know, it's really, so I mean, I hear Todd saying there's certain kinds of data and experiences that impinge on frameworks, and I hear Robert, you saying that there's a certain substrate of primary research or the development of certain fields that may be necessary before we should even start writing hypotheses about them. And I wanted to bring up a third topic along those lines, and that's that there are certain sort of ideas and levels of participation. Maybe these are two things that also impinge on theories. And I'm using as a model actually modern art, because modern art, I think, is, you know, when it started, it was really kind of the idea that whatever the form is, let's break a part of it. And that's been this running thread for the last, you know, probably 200
Say that
years.
again, whatever the form is, what?
Identify the form, and then break a part of it. You want to break that and say this too is art. I can break it here and show this too is art, and that's been playing out for centuries. I mean, I think a couple centuries at least 150 years. You've had this conversation within modern art that's saying, okay, it's kind of like watching a TV show. Each week they need to get more and more extreme because you've already seen the previous episodes. And I think there are certain ideas that kind of run like that too. And some of these diversity ideas are very simple as ideas, like, what is women's experience of this, or what are people, and what's the experience of people in Uganda with this issue that we're talking about. And they can run, I think, for centuries. And I think that that's part, I really appreciated Stephen saying, well, one of the things that Longino is doing is she is showing us the power of the feminist framework to impinge on these hypotheses. And, I think that, we have a long diversity ahead of us of women and all kinds of other diversity challenging hypotheses, as long as we do kind of what Charlotte was talking about, which is to take a welcoming stance of that voice. I'll stop there and pass the baton to Todd.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I was very much appreciative of feminist standpoint theory. I was reading it, 20 years ago or so. Because it's not, one of the main emphases there, I think I mentioned this last week, is that you really need to value, perhaps even more than other perspectives, the perspective of the person who's oppressed. And because there is a level of insight there that is extraordinarily important to help shape the conversation. But also it might be the case that they actually are seeing certain elements of reality more clearly than those who are in the position of doing the oppressing as well, or not necessarily doing the oppressing on purpose, but are in that particular, have that particular status. So that for me is critical. And one thing that I think I wanted to build on with, in terms of what I understood Stephen to be saying, is that this for me is what's being highlighted in these chapters for me really sheds light on the importance of the harmony of science and religion, in the sense that with religion, with revelation, there are certain fundamental assumptions that we just have to accept. And those assumptions then help to shape our reading of any particular reality. And the implications are extraordinary, especially when it comes to the biological sciences, or it comes to, evolutionary theory, it comes to, archaeology, all of these kinds of things. It's extraordinary what those assumptions can do to help really save a lot of time, from the perspective of being efficient, but also reduce the controversy, and also to contextualize, as I think we were saying in different respects before, the diversity that actually is essential to help move along. Because where I end up just at the end of chapter 6, for example, is that you have the diversity, but the diversity doesn't actually allow you to move, because you can either see it from this perspective or you can see it from that perspective. And if those perspectives are comprehensive, there's no point, actually, you're not really motivated to move beyond your particular perspective, unless you approach it from an ethical perspective. But from a purely epistemological perspective, you're not motivated to move beyond it. So those assumptions, those background assumptions that are provided by religion, provide in many ways that motivation. They help us to see, but they also provide the motivation to really think about how we're perceiving particular data and whether or not we're perceiving it accurately. As well.
Roger.
So maybe what I was struggling to say, Todd, you've just helped me crystallize my thinking. Thank you. That the very fact that we're stuck between two perspectives is a symptom of the immaturity of our current framework. If we're not motivated to move beyond them, it may be a symptom of we're not yet willing to look deeper. And I think that that's probably true in the case of what it is to be human. That there is the very thought that we're there doing the theorizing says that there is a unity to this, that we're stuck with two viewpoints, unable to choose between them, but we're there being stuck. And it implies that there's the potential for a unity to it. And we need to dig deeper and find what are the common assumptions between the two. And we have to have the moral courage to do that. So that's it. Thank you.
Stephen.
Yeah, but one of the things that bothers me is religion has such a bad name. And how do we, I think the answer, I'm totally convinced the answer is discourse. I mean, after all, the Universal House of Justice is saying it's one of the three things we're supposed to be doing. And we engage in these kind of discussions in society. And one of the things I think that we can do is this kind of bold, just add to the respectability of religion. That's, and bringing a mindset that you know, the Baha'i mindset that both science and religion are important parts of the answer. And I think that animates both how we study the science and how we bring religion into play. Gosh, it's a very dramatic possibility of making some progress.
Can I call on Charlotte and then Robert?
On the bottom of page 111, so it's the very last couple sentences. And she's making a point. The distance between evidence and hypothesis is not closed. And I think this is interesting because this is what we were discussing about the conspiracy theories. And well, let's just throw more evidence. Let's just put more reasoning into it, and then people will change their mind. So that's what she's suggesting, that that's not what it is. The distance between evidence and hypothesis is not closed by more data, better anatomical, physiological knowledge, principles, the theory of on and on. She says it remains an invitation to further theorizing. The availability of at least two different frameworks both keeps the gap open as far as nonpartisan observers are concerned, and reminds us of the need for background assumptions to secure the relevance of data to specific hypotheses. So, you know, in this conversation about where religion comes in, and she said, so this is more of a question to the group. I don't understand where she says that there's a need for background assumption when you have that gap is too big. Is that what she's saying? Because you can't fill it with more data and reasoning is what I'm understanding from her. So that's where we have to look at that background assumption. And then when you think of the that religious background assumption, then that could help us closing the gap. Is that, I know she's talking about something completely different, but I keep thinking about, you know, the conversation we had earlier about bringing us closer to that, you know, closing the gap basically, and that unity that we all have to gather. So anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is. Let's see. Robert, thank you, Charlotte.
I think that's an excellent point that Charlotte has made, really excellent. And to me, okay, so it's difficult in discourse because what one would want to do is charge and say, look, these are the background assumptions and so on. But there are three of the fundamental background assumptions in the faith would make this whole issue put it on a whole different plane. So man is a spiritual being. men and women are equal. The human race is one. You know, these three things, it washes over everything, and it provides a unified vision, which would enable progress to be made in all these areas that she's talking about. So how do you present that? Well, okay, there's some things you can present which would be accepted. The idea of man being a spiritual being, that might draw a lot of criticism. So you have to be careful about at the moment, you know, about jumping in to say that. You know.
And also I would add that the other one is purpose.
Mm.
And, and that's very difficult as well in a scientific discussion. That
you mean our purpose is to create an ever advancing civilization? Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
even the purpose of humans here, you know.
Yeah, there was a purpose behind evolution.
Yeah.
Very hard to.
Yeah.
Right.
He does actually address that a little tiny bit on page 128. She's talking about the evolutionary studies and behavioral studies that have been the focus of attention resemble inquiry on related questions. The difference consists of what I've been calling the stability of the assumptions. But the point where she does bring it in is the public function of scientific knowledge as a resource for argumentation. It just struck me as this is bringing in one of the contextual concerns explicitly into the scientific process, and it's a difference of kind.
Where are you reading?
I think it's page 128. The paragraph begins the aims of two kinds of research.
Oh yes, right. Okay, got it. Yeah.
No, that's not correct.
Oh,
It's just before that.
okay.
The paragraph, it's the role of values is the header title, the section title.
Right.
So it's the first paragraph right in there.
Okay.
Oh,
yes, right, got it. Okay, yeah, stability of those assumptions. Yeah.
It's a small point. It's a small point, but it's a revealing point. And okay.
You, Roger. Todd.
You go before me, Whitney.
Oh, no, sorry, I'd already shifted my attention to you. Sorry, you go ahead. Thank you, though.
Well, I was just going to say that, just building on what Robert was saying. So in the research that I did for my dissertation, some of the emphasis was on how particular background assumptions affect the way in which medical categories are developed, particularly around women. Somebody just disappeared.
Farhad.
Right. Yeah. So, and the example, actually, this was brought up in also the paper that Whitney was referring to, about the development of certain disease categories like hysteria, for example, that if the assumption that had been informing the medical community at that time had been that women and men are equal, then that particular disease category would not have been constructed. And it's the same thing with diseases, quote unquote, that were constructed in order to explain the behavior of slaves, you know, because obviously it was a slave economy, and so they needed to justify why slaves were running away from their masters. So they described it as a disease. So obviously, if they had the concept of the oneness of humanity, that disease would never have been, quote unquote, discovered. It wouldn't exist. It wouldn't even be, you know, it wouldn't even be conceivable to think of that as an explanation for that behavior. Same thing with we had recognized that women and men were equal, and we had seen that perhaps these conditions were oppressive, we wouldn't come up with a disease category hysteria to explain their erratic behavior. We realized, no, these conditions are not appropriate to the equality of women and men. So yeah, I think these fundamental assumptions about oneness, about equality of women and men, and about nobility of every human being have tremendous implications for many areas of science as well. And just the second thing I wanted to mention was, in terms of what, Stephen, what you were saying about religion, I think we have to become very adept at describing why it is that religion has gotten a bad name. We have to be able to sympathize with many of these neo-Darwinists or atheists, whatever they are, even though they have gone too far, they become fundamentalists themselves. But we have to find some points of unity, I think, and say, well, yes, for this reason, this reason, this reason, and this reason, it's understandable why they would be criticizing religion. And then the second thing I think we have to become adept at is describing why naturalism is a viable alternative in light of the fact that religion, can be seen in this particular way. So why is it that naturalism makes a lot of sense? There are good reasons for why it makes a lot of sense. Obviously we don't find it sufficient as Baha'is. Obviously it ignores certain realities that we know exist, but there are good reasons for why people have adopted naturalism. So being able to describe what those are, I think, is another way to help sort of build points of unity that where we can then engage, as you were saying, Stephen, in these discourses that are so critical to advancing thought.
Yeah, I like that. Can I just ask for a point of clarification, Todd? When you say naturalism, it means the kind of that atheistic perspective that we can understand everything within what we can perceive. We don't reach beyond to it.
Everything boils down to a physical reality and can be explained in physical terms.
Is that also the doctrine of physicalism or materialism?
Yeah, I mean, physicalism would be a sort of a subcategory of naturalism.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So yeah, I guess I wanted to talk about that, like Charlotte made that comment about the public use as coming into as another resource for science. And I've been reflecting on shifts in thinking due to this last weird year. Like I mentioned earlier, I think it is a collective education that maybe we haven't fully realized everything that we've all learned about it. But I think there's a focusing of the mind that crises can provide to a really diverse science. And maybe I'm gonna make it like a diversity at the level of Baha'i scholarship, that any Baha'i who is applying the revelation to understand the world is a Baha'i scholar. I think that we've had that with the development of the COVID vaccine. There's been such an emphasis on actually solving the problem rather than on necessarily building a corporation or building an academic career, but there's been sharing of information, and these vaccines have been generated really rapidly. And now people are really turning their attention to how to get the vaccines in arms. And I think it's kind of a remarkable thing to see something move this quickly. Similarly, I think the George Floyd killing just brought out into the minds of so many people who were not thinking about, weren't aware of these things, or thinking about it as obsessively as some members of the society have been. It's just generated a certain moral stance where there's a lot of unity around it. I'm reminded of the Universal House of Justice's letter to the religious leaders. I think it was around 1990 or so.
2002.
2002?
Yeah.
Okay. A lot later than I was thinking. Anyway, one of their points was that over the previous 150 years, there's been generated a unity of thought, at least among academics and leaders, on a lot of their moral issues, the equality of women and men, the equality of people among races. And I think that, you know, maybe we need to stay in touch with these sort of this evolving moral response to the world in order for us to defend religion's place in the world. You know, I think that what's coming on the horizon is people finally paying enough attention to the crisis of greenhouse gases. And I think that we may need to be prepared by our recent experiences to go out and say, you know, we can all feel this is, we have a very large level of unity that this is going to, you know, eventually we're going to have the unity that this is a problem that needs to be solved. And I know we're seeing a lot of conspiracy theories that I think is a coping mechanism, a denial coping mechanism, that people are aware of the crisis and they are retreating into this imaginary thinking that probably needs to be solved by the unity of science and religion. But I think it's actually a recognition that it is an unconscious recognition of the problem that needs to be solved. Okay, Stephen, Robert.
I'm very eager to see what happens as Charlotte works out some of the implications of her thinking, which I think is centrally important. One of the things I've been doing lately is looking at the reports generated by the Pew Research Center on issues of science and religion. The Wellcome Center in England, which is one of the recent studies is 140,000 people all around the world, asking them questions about science and then about science and religion. One of the central findings is that media can ask questions in a certain way to make people appear or to even vote in a way that seems fundamentalist. And if they ask questions in another way, you get an entirely different set of answers.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, there's also diversity and a wrongness to the way we understand the issues. It turns out that the elite professors in the elite universities are strongly biased against religion, and lots of other people are not, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we start to do what Charlotte's talking about, then we free up a whole new dimension of the issue.
That's really interesting, Robert. And then we probably should start wrapping up as we're approaching.
Well, I was going to say, you know, that the letter that you brought up, Whitney, you know, the 2002 letter to religious leaders. In that letter, perhaps it contains a fruitful approach that we could take. So when religion has remained faithful to the teachings of its founders, then it's done this. There's a whole paragraph on this. You know, it's caused people to dare greatly and so on. And then the problem, the current problem, is that the notion that all religions are equally valid in nature and origin is still stubbornly being resisted. So, in effect, as long as somebody denies this fundamental fact that all the major religions are equally valid in nature and origin, then religion is going to be a cause of what's the word? It will not be a cause of progression, as long as that fundamental fact is not recognized, or those sects, those religious leaders that don't accept that, will not be able to contribute to the advancement of society. And so that might be a stance that we could take. We have to word it more carefully the way I word it. worded it, but that might be a stance, a fruitful stance to take with people who are so strongly against religion.
Mhm. Well, that sounds like maybe, oh, Roger? Yes.
Well, yeah, well, okay, maybe I should just hold it, but we're talking about the value of having
Share.
deeper and deeper perspective. In other words, to help resolve theoretical difficulties, dig deeper. When there's a conflict of paradigms, dig deeper, find out what deeper assumptions or ideas can help knit them into a greater whole. And that's something religion is quintessentially designed for,
Mm.
is achieving a unified world vision. Okay, so yeah, it's out of time. I mean, we're nominally a 90-minute program and we're here at 110.
90
You know,
minutes is a subset of that 110.
But the
just sent
question
you the
is, are
link.
we going to continue the discussion of 6 and 7 next week? Is there more to say and talk about? I
I
think
think
probably
so.
yes.
Why not do 7? I feel that chapter 6 illustrated and animated the more metaphysical discussions we were having earlier.
Okay,
I'd be happy to do that because I haven't read 7 yet.
okay, okay. Good, I just wanted to clarify.
Thank you for clarifying that. Okay, chapter 7 next week with more discussion of writing and more discussion of the metaphysics of it. So would someone like to say a closing prayer?
Metapsychics. I think we're going to have to work on metapsychics.
Charlotte, do you have a prayer available?
Yes, I do.
Thank
Say,
you.
I keep thinking we need a prayer for teaching. Okay, here we go. Oh God, my God, aid thou thy trusted servants to have loving and tender hearts. Help them to spread amongst all the nations of the earth the light of guidance that cometh from the company on high. Verily, thou art the strong, the powerful, the mighty, the all-subduing, the ever-giving. Verily, thou art the generous, the gentle, the tender, and the most bountiful. Abdul Baha. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
If
you.
somebody
That
can
made my
please
heart
just
sing.
give me a couple of days extra this week, I'll get the videos posted.
Oh,
Okay, by fiat, we will declare this to be a 9-day week. Is that okay?
Right, that's it.
Robert, I didn't know you had that power in you. I would have approached it months ago.
I'll have to pray for it really, really sincerely, but I'm not saying it'll be answered.
Todd, thanks for the link. Are we going to use this paper that everybody's been talking about?
The letter to the religious leaders?
Yeah.
I mean,
Use it.
it just made me curious. I'm going to read it again, but you know what I keep going back to is the peace message. It is more relevant now. I mean, I read it and I studied it. When did it come out?
It came out right when I became a Baha'i.
Yeah,
And,
there,
and Century
first
of
thing
Light.
I did was distribute
Wow.
that letter.
yeah. I mean, it's just so
86,
relevant.
85.
It's so relevant now. I'm just amazed. Anyway.
And
I think the
Century of
answer
Light
is,
and Revelation and Social Reality, both.
I think the answer is that we have to read it by ourselves and bring issues to our conversation that we want to talk about, maybe.
Yeah.
Eventually, I still want us to take up in a more formal way a study of consultation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to too.
Yeah. Yeah. And if anybody has an opportunity, I've mentioned this before, it's book 10. So it's called It's book 10, unit 2, and it's
Yeah.
on consultation. Wonderful, wonderful
fantastic.
study. Yeah. And that's something we can do with our individual communities as well.
Mhm.
Thank you,
Well,
everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye all.
everybody.
Thanks.
See you next week, if not before. Bye,
Inshallah.
Farhad.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right.